It is indeed my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Rob van der Laarse, who is, as many of you well know, the founding director of the Amsterdam School for Heritage, Memory and Material Culture, and is also holding the University of Amsterdam Westerbork Chair of the European Heritage and Memory of War. Professor van der Laarse is a leader of a number of major heritage projects and also participates in several others. Let me just list a few of them. Accessing Campscapes, Terrorscapes, Transnational Memory in Post-War Europe, and finally, what I believe is his latest project, that is Landscapes of War, Trauma and Occupation, which is carried out in partnership with Cambridge University as well as several other European universities, museums and memorial centers. In addition to the cultural roots and post-war memory of the Holocaust, Professor van der Laarse also publishes widely on early modern European elites, intellectual culture and cultural landscapes. And it is our great pleasure to have you here with us. Professor van der Laarse, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Robert. I'm very pleased to be here and to be invited in this very beautiful city and this also, I must say, very intriguing part of the city. We heard Professor Puccia yesterday already mentioning the specific location and its combination, of course, with Hans Frank's Wawel Castle and so on, and only to remind that when we walk outside, we are going back in time on former Adolf Hitler Platz. So, that brings me actually immediately to my point, remembering and commemoration. The recent 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in Polish Auschwitz on the 27th of January 2015 was by far the most contested remembrance of the Second World War after the ending of the Cold War. For along some 300 survivors and tens of presidents and royalty, the most notable absentee was actually Vladimir Putin, head of the state of the former Allied country that with 21 million soldiers and civilians killed, was most affected by the Second World War and whose Red Army liberated all Nazi death camps in Poland before defeating Hitler in Berlin. In response to the international sanctions imposed by the European Union against Russia because of the annexation of the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, the Russian president had to stay in Moscow. You see him in that, I don't know if I can point that, but probably you all see it over there. He is in this, saluting the Red Army soldiers, and his speech is in the Jewish Historical Museum in Moscow, instead of what you see there, this incredible large tent in the gate of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is probably the most iconic place of Europe, at least in a negative sense. So the symbolic isolation of Russia was hardly less remarkable than a meeting of 60 members of the Israeli Knesset in the Valley of Dead of Auschwitz-Birkenau on the invitation of the Polish government on Holocaust Memorial Day 2014, in what an Israeli journalist noticed, what can be the biggest slap in the face anyone could ever give Hitler. That is 2014. So such media and memory events, the term has already been used today, show clearly the impact of Europe's 20th century cultural heritage of war and terror. Yet this process takes in Western and Central Eastern Europe very different forms. Also that's mentioned. And if the memorialization of the Second World War followed initially along national and often nationalist lines, with the destruction of the Iron Curtain, the wars in former Yugoslavia, the expansion and consolidation of the European Union, and the so-called Holocaust memory boom, Auschwitz and other Nazi and Holocaust-related terrorscapes have become critically important icons of modern European, if not Western, identity. Thus, Orange visits Auschwitz, a Dutch newspaper headed 6 June 2012, when the national football team there to have a dark tourism experience while training for the UEFA European Football Championship in Poland and Ukraine. I think everyone remembers here that these two countries then organized that together. And though psychologists were added to the team, the young international sportsmen were actually deeply moved, if not shocked, after entering the gate, the other gate of Auschwitz, and walked along also the ramp of Birkenau. And some players called it an unbelievable and undescribable experience, an impression confirmed by photographs, as you see, made by invited press agencies. I must say, I don't know if it was a wise decision to do that, because actually the Dutch they were regarded as the possible champion of the whole UEFA Cup, but actually they lost every game, and from that moment on, Dutch football has never been recovered. So don't do things like that, I would give as an advice. Whatever, the entering of the iconic gate of Europe's heart of darkness and the symbolic crossing of the still existing mental border of the Iron Curtain seem to have become a trend among Western rich or famous. And this might be regarded, of course, as a success of the so-called Stockholm Declaration of the International Forum on the Holocaust of January 2000, by which 44 world leaders declared the Shoah to be the main challenge of Western civilization, of which the cruelty and magnitude should be forever seared in our collective memory. A new genocide should be prevented by research, education, and remembrances, to plant the seeds of a better future amidst the soil of a bitter past. Yet, Auschwitz's role as universal symbol of the Holocaust was for long not as obvious as one might think. Which you see here, it's the struggle on actually what Auschwitz is. Is it a Polish national site? Is it a Jewish site, etc.? In contrast, you could say, to the earlier Soviet discovery of Majdanek on July 1944, Auschwitz liberation actually did not attract that much foreign attention at the time. And although, of course, already in Nuremberg, 1945-46, the trials, and in particular also the Polish Auschwitz trials, the gas chambers were mentioned, and Auschwitz became a sort of, let's say, part of collective cultural memory. If you remind this 1947 date of the Polish Auschwitz trial, which was also the same date as the... oh, sorry, there's something going wrong with the ordering of... yeah. It's the same date as actually this Wanda Jakobowska movie, the first, you could call it now, first Holocaust movie, actually. Wanda Jakobowska was a Polish prisoner of the female part of Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. She survived and made together with another survivor this incredible, interesting movie, already in 1947, based on a sort of, would now call oral history, almost a sort of ethnic research, not ethnic, a sort of research based on the stories of what people experience in the camp. It's an incredibly interesting story because you see there also already IG Farben werken, which actually is almost forgotten for quite a long time after the war. 1947 was also the moment when Primo Levi's published his Sequestro in Homo, If This Is a Man, and also the year the Polish State Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau was founded. And interestingly, all that was regarded with the beginning of the Cold War, just let's say at that moment or a year later, as a communist propaganda campaign. So Auschwitz, you could say, the largest Nazi concentration camp, disappeared already quite early from at least Western collective memory. And of course that changed with Elie Wiesel's Night in 1960, the publication, or the Eichmann trial in particular, 1961-1960, which you could see as sort of a second wave, which brought Auschwitz back into Western memory, although its iconic meaning as the paradigm camp of the Holocaust, also the term Holocaust, only dates from what you could now call the Americanization of the Holocaust. So after this first phase, which was regarded already quite early as communist kind of narrative, you see only in the 1980s with 1978, actually, with the American TV miniseries Holocaust, and then later on with Sophie's Choice, 1982, etc., all these Holocaust movies, you could say it became a kind of Western phenomenon. And of course, not only American, also European, which is Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which I found actually one of the most intriguing documentaries ever made on Holocaust as a lieu de mémoire. He actually, in 1985, in this 9-hour documentary, invented that whole concept. Of course, also at the same time, when Pierre Nora started, coined more or less the term lieu de mémoire. Lanzmann related that to what we could now call traumascapes. So not only Auschwitz, also the Reinhard camps, Treblinka, Sobibor. And also related this concept of trauma to oral history, which you see the barber there on the left. It's a famous episode actually here, where the barber of Treblinka doesn't want to speak, and then at a certain moment is going to speak almost without willing it, but in this strange situation when he certainly is asked to cut someone's hair. And then his memory seems to be in his fingers and he can't stop anymore. This memory comes back, he wants the camera to stop, but Lanzmann goes on filming. And it tells stories he never recalled before. That is not easy to see, to watch, I must say, but it made a big impression. This combination of trauma and lieu de mémoire. So, although the age of extremes, terrorized by Nazism, communism and civil war, seem to have finally ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the shock of the Srebrenica massacre of 1995 opened the eyes for the possibility that history repeats itself. Actually, in my view, the unusual call for military intervention, framed in Western Europe and the US from the perspective of the atrocities of the Nazi concentration camps, think at Omaška, Prijedor, 1992, that was illustrative for the new symbolic role of the Holocaust. Of course, also Sarajevo, and as I said, in particular, this situation here in Srebrenica, that played an immense role. So you could say, well, the memorialization of the First and the Second World War had developed up to then mostly along national lines. The Yugoslav War of the 1990s made the European community embrace the Holocaust memory boom as a mnemonic policy, actually, for integration, on the assumption of a common, painful, unique, shared past of universal value. So following the earlier founding of national war and resistance museums, most Western European countries have since then established Holocaust museums, memorial and remembrances, and compensation laws for families of Holocaust victims and survivors. Thus the dynamic of Holocaust memory is rooted as much in a European experience as it is in the globalized mediatization, universalization or Americanization of the Holocaust. As such, the Auschwitz paradigm was used not only for a strengthening of the European Union's inward consolidation, the choice for Auschwitz testified at the same time, still, we're speaking about 2000, to Russia's inclusion in the Holocaust paradigm, and even more, the Holocaust paradigm functioned as an undisputed entry ticket to this Holocaust-centered mnemonic community, to speak with Wolf Kahnsteiner, during the EU's eastward expansion from 12 to 27 member states in 2004-2007, to date 28 member states, of course, with Croatia 2013, and possibly within a few years 27 again after Brexit. So in retrospect, the Stockholm Declaration appeared to provide a moment of clarity, founded on the paradigmatic meaning of Auschwitz for the newly united, humanistic and peaceful Europe, which reached its climax with the 2012 awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize for the EU's contributions to the advancement of peace and reconciliation between France and Germany, for bringing democracy and human rights in Southern Europe, for defeating the divisions between East and West, and for strengthening or reconciliation in the Balkans. And yet, we have to ask, how European is this community? Or better said, how shared are these European experiences and memories? Until recently, the European project was held for a success story. But does such a shared heritage really exist? I will argue that the assumption of the Holocaust as a common European experience and hence as a basic part of Europe's post-war identity raises some critical questions. In the first place, after the events of 11 September 2001 and the beginning of the War on Terror, the eastwards enlargement of the EU, the 2009 Europe crisis, the 2016 Brexit referendum, all have fundamentally challenged the idea of a Holocaust-centered European mnemonic community. Secondly, the Holocaust paradigm is currently in Europe's age of crisis challenged by deep incompatibility of opinions about the impact, interpretation and meaning of the world wars and the Cold War, throwing a shadow over the European project. Thirdly, in many parts of Europe and beyond, populist identity politics have fostered a massive uncovering of hidden genocides, unearthed initially for the sake of transitional justice, out of respect for the victims, as we've also noticed already many times here in this conference, though increasingly used for the sake of national politics of victimization, which is a big risk actually, and I must say I don't personally have an answer. As while Western celebrities discover the East on Holocaust travel, their Eastern counterparts are questioning the Western dominance over Europe's collective memory in terms of a post-colonial or occupation paradigm. On 15 March 2012, more than 200,000 Hungarians were protesting in Budapest, led by their, at that time still young, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, with support of hundreds of Polish and Lithuanian nationalists against what they called an international occupation. Just like the Hungarian revolt of 1848 against the Habsburg Empire and the 1956 revolt against Soviet occupation, the Hungarian nationalists now seem to be ready for revolt against the European Union. For Hungary will never be a colony of the EU, as an astonished Dutch journalist headed her newspaper article on the Hungarian leader's speech. For Orban's fierce message is not only that the center of Europe has moved to the east, but also that the time has come for Eastern Europe's strong Christian nations to rescue the weak and decaying continent from its Western humanist degeneration. Peaceful old Europe suffering from a self-proclaimed guild of nations. Interestingly, this geopolitical shift was already foreshadowed by the 2008 Prague Declaration on European consciousness of conscience and communism, by which Central Eastern European countries request from the EU the persecution of communist crimes on terms equal to that of Nazi crimes and genocide, and to recognize communism and Nazism as a common legacy to be dealt with in the same way as the Nuremberg trial or tribunal did with Nazi crimes. This so-called occupation or double genocide doctrine has been adopted in 2009 by an EU Parliament resolution recommending a European-wide day of remembrance and for the victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and declaring the crimes of communist terror and occupation as equally important for Europe's collective memory as the Holocaust. Now, instead of a more inclusive, multi-directional widening of the Holocaust paradigm, the occupation paradigm has fostered unexpected Holocaust dissonances, which currently link up with Western European and American right-wing populism, and even with Holocaust revisionism. So we may ask, is the European Union and the ITF's mission of Holocaust, or ERA's mission, I have to say today, of Holocaust education, remembrance and research not strongly politically and ethically biased? What about the misuse and abuse of the Holocaust or Auschwitz paradigm by present-day politicians, media personalities, and memory makers? Put otherwise, is the Holocaust paradigm really all-embracing, universal and global? Or should it be understood as a dominant narrative competing with other war experiences, mnemonic spaces, and counter-narratives? as for this occasion here, because there are many European examples to find to make clear how it works, but I decided when I arrived here to change my story in that sense and not to give you a sort of European overview, but going into somewhat deeper in this Polish-Ukrainian memory war, it's already called today, because it's quite illustrative, I think, for actually what we talk about, and many people here in their papers talked about. So, let's say, for no less remarkable than what we noticed, the above mentioned absence of Putin at the Auschwitz remembrance 70 years after the end of the Second World War, was actually the prominent presence on that day of the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who actually claimed even that not the Russians liberated Auschwitz, but the Ukrainians, because he said, well, it was this Red Army, maybe, but in the Red Army, this was the Ukrainian battalion, which actually were the liberators. So this remarkable change of roles, as you could say, which I must say happens now in many memorial sites, who to invite, all these sites where Russian POWs were during the war, who to invite? Who should you invite? Still the Russian ambassador, or should you now invite the Ukrainian ambassador? This is not simply theoretical. It's everywhere where I come, I have to answer this kind of questions. So it is a remarkable change of roles that only take place now, at this moment, this very moment, and has a lot to do with what we are questioning today. So I would say, besides a geopolitical transformation, we also witness a discursive transformation. So clearly the European continent is not only strewed with lots of newly discovered terrascapes, John Turbricht would say new resources, the resources ever rise and take and become larger and more. But we also witness that many former communist countries do not seem to be willing to handle their traumatic war and post-war experiences in terms of the Holocaust master narrative. And it is because of such nationalization of victimhood that most Ukrainians do not identify with, let's say, with this, the Holocaust by bullet, or here, Babi Yar, for example, where the Germans executed in 1941 more than 33,000 Jewish victims in the Babi Yar massacre in Kiev in the Reven, which is probably the largest single shooting mass killing of the Holocaust. But it's hardly revealed even in the current memorial park in Kiev's Reven of Oblivion, as it mentioned, where most monuments commemorate supposed non-Jewish victims of Nazi terror, such as 621 Ukrainian nationalists and 2 Orthodox priests. Thus, the anti-communist partisan leader Stefan Bandera, also his name is mentioned already today, killed after the war by the KGB, has been posthumously proclaimed a national hero in Ukraine. Rediscovered, as you see here, during the Maidan revolt, where his portrait was taken by some on their breast. He's embraced today as the national founding father of modern Ukraine, already starting in the 2005 Orange Revolution and made official now in this 2014-2015 Euromaidan regime. And Bandera monuments have been erected everywhere in Western Ukraine, now also in Eastern Ukraine, in Central Ukraine, and Bandera museums have been opened. Yet Bandera, as you probably know better than I, Bandera is being held for a war criminal in Russia, Poland, also in Israel, of course, for his support of ethnic cleansing operations during the last German occupation. So notwithstanding the official veteran status of its last surviving members, Bandera's militant section of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, so-called OUNB, the UNB for Bandera, was, according to Polish researchers, responsible for the death of 40,000 to 60,000 Poles during the 1942-43 Volhynia massacres. So on the one hand, we see Bandera in Lviv football stadium as our hero. on Ukrainian stamps, but also the massacre site and the memorial. So responsible for Volhynia massacre, which took 40 to 60,000 victims and also forced 450,000 others to flee from the region. A painful chapter, you could say, a very painful chapter in Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish history, which might easily stir, of course, new ethnic memory conflicts. And yeah, in a certain way, it's quite remarkable that during this European-Russian thaw, you could say, after 1989 up to maybe 2010, 2012, that was also a period which you saw bettering of Polish-Ukrainian relations. And still, of course, I noticed already this UEFA Football Cup, and still maybe also in 2015 you could regard something like that in, with the Ukrainian-Polish Historical Committee installed to commonly investigate the Volhynia massacre crimes. Yet, in July 2016, the Polish Parliament voted unanimously for a Senate resolution to acknowledge Volhyn as a genocide by Ukrainian nationalists against the Second Polish Republic, and declared the 11th of July the National Day of Remembrance. Ukraine, almost on this new Polish Remembrance Day, renamed Moskovsky Prospect in Kiev, provocatively, Prospect Stepan Bandera. And Ukraine's nationalist party furiously responded to the Polish Memorial Day by calling the Polish post-colonial parliamentary resolution a step in the back. The Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrances spoke about a growing anti-Ukrainian hysteria provoked by political forces. The Ukrainian ambassador in Poland suggested a plot of the Russian Secret Service. And the Ukrainian parliament sent a hard lesson by passing a bill on the genocide committed by the Polish state against Ukrainians in the years 1919-1951, with a group of politicians and intellectuals, a group of politicians and intellectuals called on the parliament to establish, actually in Ukraine, not one, but 3 remembrance days for Ukrainian victims of Polish crimes. So, let's say, if that's not enough, a few months later, you see here, in October last year, was the release of Volhyn, this long-awaited movie of Wojciech Smarzowski's in 2016 on the Volhynia massacre, suddenly revealed, let's say, the silenced truth of the Ukrainian cruelty directed against the Poles, portrayed from a Polish bottom-up perspective, so to speak, as a ruthless orgy of violence. Plans for a Ukrainian release, which originally existed, had to be postponed, as the script completely violates the authorized, as politically legal, politically correct view of Ukrainian historians that Volhynia was basically a non-political peasant fury against oppressive Polish, if not Jewish, elites, and not at all a lasting campaign of political violence inspired or controlled by Bandera's OUN. Considering the judgment of the Polish Institute of National Memory, after consulting its Ukrainian colleagues, there seems to be no space anymore for academic consensus. I quote, "All this is in line with the pro-Bandera propaganda put forward during the last stages of World War II and successfully promoted after the war by émigré Ukrainian nationalists, which means Canadian nationalist historians associated with OUNB." Ukraine is of many Ukrainians. Nationalists created a diaspora community in Canada, as probably most of you know. At the same time, the Israeli President Rivlin, speaking in the Ukrainian parliament on the event of the 57th anniversary of Babi Yar on 28 September 2016, openly accused Bandera's OUN of cooperating with the German SS in murdering the Kiev Jews. The current OUN deputy chairman, Bogdan Chervak, could only furiously respond that Rivlin must have watched too much Russian TV, which is not just bad, but embarrassingly. The chairman of the Ukrainian Remembrance Institute, Vladimir Vyotrov, simply denied any OUN involvement in the Holocaust and noted that honoring the memory of victims of Babi Yar would be more sincere without the use of myths of those who erased the memory of them. To strengthen their case, Ukrainian nationalist politicians and memory activists even demanded public support from the Ukrainian Jews. Yet 29 Jewish communities and organizations, Ukrainian organizations, responded with a public letter against the Memory Institute's attempt to rewrite history, suppression and denial of anti-Semitic ideology and practices, which they held for an insult to the memory of over 1 million Jews murdered in Ukraine by the Nazis and local collaborators, and moreover, a case of Holocaust denial. So clearly, behind every fact, politics are at stake. Behind every conflict lurks the ghost of dead. So what about truth-finding? Archaeologists may dig for bullets, historians for documents. But we may still guess at the numbers of victims of Stalin's Great Terror, the Nazi bullet holocaust, the NKVD prison massacres, and the Nazi massacres of Soviet prisoners of war in 1941. Actually, more than with the victims of Babi Yar or Soviet POWs, among, by the way, many Ukrainians, Ukrainians nowadays identify mostly with the victims of Vinnytsia massacre. Killed by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, during Stalin's Great Purge of 1937-1938, and during the 1941 NKVD prison massacres. So interestingly, the forensic evidence of those crimes had been used already in 1943 by Nazi war propaganda, like that of Polish Katyn. This is, by the way, the this is Nazi war propaganda, but then reused. By that of Polish Katyn as proof of a Judeo-Bolshevik violence committed against Ukrainian people. According to Soviet documents released after 1991, the death toll of the Ukrainian prison massacres numbers at about 9,000 people and some 20,000, 30,000 in eastern Poland, now also Ukraine. Anti-Russian authors estimate much higher numbers, however, and as if you could also, there is a sort of law of communicating vessels going on. You see, if Holocaust numbers lower, then anti-communist numbers rise. So that's the victims of communist terror. That is the sort of relationship between these two. And unfortunately, this seems strongly influenced by how violent past are used for present politics of memory. Thus, by revealing NKVD massacres of Polish and Ukrainian citizens and the involvement of Jewish officers by means of horrifying images like this one you see here on Katyn, of dead bodies captured in photographs, pamphlets, journals and cinema, the German war propaganda effectively silenced the already accomplished 1939 Nazi genocide on Polish intelligentsia, for example. I heard that now archaeologists from Lodz University are doing actually archaeological research on that. It's not often mentioned. And also, of course, the German war of the Nazi genocide on already 1943 5 million Jews. It also successfully, you could say, framed, this is path dependency, a term we noticed today, the unwanted past for Polish and Ukrainian people up to today. So whereas these Western post-war reports and their uncritical use, you could say, by memory activists up to today, objectified in many cases Nazi propaganda, as on the other hand there is an objectivation of Soviet and NKVD propaganda from the same period, new memory wars over those documents have begun to emerge also on the internet. Propagated by neo-Nazis suggesting an American Jewish conspiracy of silence, the ethnic component of Vinnytsia, Ukrainian Katyn, they built upon claims that were actually quite close to the original unedited German sources of 1943. And so as one of the cyber militants argued already 20 years ago, an American Holocaust denier, the Jews own all the media. And the Ukrainians don't own Hollywood, so they can't make movie dramas about Vinnytsia, either like Steven Spielberg does about a so-called Holocaust. This was 20 years ago. Now, interestingly, in recent decades, this situation has completely changed. In Ukraine, the victims of communism have since then been constructed as victims of the Holodomor. The official term coined by the diasporic Ukrainian scholars in the US and Canada, which is enshrined in Ukrainian law as the Ukrainian genocide, or Ukraine's unknown Holocaust. In what could be framed as a remarkable example of long-distance nationalism, it's also recognized in Canada by the Holodomor Memorial Day Act of 2008, comparable to the Holocaust Remembrance Day. The thesis draws back to Robert Conquest's pioneering Harvest of Sorrow of 1986, which, though strongly criticized at the time for its use of sources and setting as much too high numbers, it has become the academic legitimation of the Holodomor as a planned act of genocide. Now, to be clear about that, although historical evidence has suggested already astonishing number of as much as 3.3 million people died from famine in Ukraine in that period, and also 1 million, by the way, in Kazakhstan, because of the Soviet collectivization of, or during the Soviet collectivization of private agriculture, and of course the role the NKVD played in terrorizing the peasants. But notwithstanding the massive scale of NKVD terror campaigns, proof of an intended genocidal aim of Stalin's deadly terror famine to the, let's say, aimed at Ukrainians as an ethnicity, thus far has not been found in the Moscow archives. Drawing from the repertoire of the Holocaust commemoration, already in the wake of the Orange Revolution, Ukrainian parliaments established the 4th Saturday of November as official National Liberation or Remembrance Day, whereas President Yushchenko already declared the denial of the Holodomor punishable by law, a policy re-implemented under the 2015 Poroshenko administration. Evoked already by Hitler, who since his victorious 1933 election campaign in Germany referred already then to the Ukrainian famine and the millions of people starving in a country that could be a breadbasket for the world as proof of the evil intention of Marxism, the hidden Ukrainian hunger terror is still, after time and time, revealed as a trope by right-wing nationalists. Notwithstanding its post-1991 canonization in and by school books in Ukraine, monuments, remembrances, literature, testimonies, oral history programs, etc., the Holodomor is still regarded a hidden truth, found its way into popular media under that heading. So the American filmmaker Bobby Lay promoted his Ukrainian TV series Holodomor, compare the American TV series Holocaust, 2008, as a production about the biggest lie, the best kept secret, although the first Ukrainian TV documentary on the Holodomor, or as the terror famine was called that day, was already released during Gorbachev's glasnost. Having raised the death toll even beyond the official figure at that time, the series claimed that by the end of 1933, within 1 year, 10 million Ukrainians, including 3 million unborn children, died because of the famine genocide. So, to quote Holodomor, I quote now the American filmmaker, Holodomor will tell the story of the cold-blooded destruction of human life, which has been silenced from the world for over 7 decades. Whereas post-Soviet Ukraine has been accused of erasing the memory of the Holocaust by the black-red Holodomor myth, Ukrainian and Canadian right-wing activists are currently accusing Russian and Israeli Holocaust defenders of erasing Holocaust memory. So you see there's a sort of zero-sum game going on at this moment, an absurd competing memories, instead of trying to combine and to relate these terrible events. So hence, Europe's geopolitical shift may cause enormous problems in the EU's dealing with the past and its external relations with Israel, the USA, neighboring Russia, whose post-war national identity, of course, as we know, is still grounded on the anti-fascist myth of the Great Patriotic War. Now, let us now compare this to only a decade ago. Still Poland, still under post-1989 climate of reconciliation, Andrzej Wajda's movie Katyn in 2007 addressed for the first time Poland's double victimhood of Nazi and Soviet terror to a wider public. Yet Katyn was still successfully released on the Russian state television at the eve of a common Polish-Russian commemoration of the 70th anniversary of Katyn massacre in April 2010. I know that many people now here, Polish, know that this was not a very successful event. You know, it was Russian Prime Minister Medvedev which invited his Polish colleague Donald Tusk at that time to come over and commemorate together. And made with support of the nationalist President Lech Kaczynski, that's sometimes forgotten, Wajda's film was even rebroadcasted in Russia after the fatal air crash in Smolensk that cost 96 high-ranking politicians, including the president and his wife, his life. The crash was, according to Prime Minister Tusk's prophetic words, the most tragic Polish event since the war. Yet soon afterwards, complot theories began to spread in the internet about Moscow's planned murder of the Polish elite as the second Katyn, immediately followed by similar accusations voiced by leading right-wing Polish politicians. And after the 2015 elections, the right-wing government immediately reopened the investigation of the Smolensk crash. Research was already closed in 2014, building upon and further leading to what you could say is a kind of complot theory. So in retrospect, this could be regarded the beginning of the end of the European-Russian defrost after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are other events, I don't mention them, my own country is very much involved, as you know, in the MH17 air crash, with even more deaths, Dutch death in this case. Memory wars and paradigm shifts of this kind will never be resolved by top-down European declarations, memory laws and legal procedures, in my view, nor by memorial museums and media productions on their own, because they, as long as they tend to decontextualize and isolate massacres, like in movies as Katyn, but even more Wallin and Holodomor, from a genocidal victimhood perspective. I think this is very crucial. In view of these mediated memory appropriated, even small conflicts about painful past trigger traumatic memories and run the risk of ending up in a clash of cultures. So as to conclude, I would like to argue that playing with the dead is never an innocent game. Forensic archaeologists, physical anthropologists may claim that bones never lie, but human remains and belongings are far the most tabooed, politicized and signified evidence of Europe's age of extremes. And the objectification of archaeological truth-finding should warn us that under the hot conditions of memory wars, digging deeper may reveal the truth as much as it may feed new myths and ethnic hatred when used for one-sided narratives which might tell the truth but not the whole truth. Thus, to recapitulate, although it is, no, let me show one thing first of last. Huh?
Sorry. It is my topic.
Oh, well, I will skip this topic. This was the other topic which I would like to have talked today. Yes, Nowa. Actually part of my research project. But, okay, no, but because I'm from the Netherlands, it's interesting to let you show this, because my story now focused very much on Central Eastern Europe, Poland and Ukraine in particular. But I want to blame my own country also in this sense. But this is a map actually made in 2015, also 2015, because of the 7th anniversary of the ending of the Second World War. It's about Liberation Route Europe. You can find it on the internet. It's now already a little bit changed, the website. But this is the 2015 version. And actually what you see, well, anyone can see that this is a very Western, let's say, oriented map of the Second World War. But if you don't understand me wrong, but you see everything comes from the West, the liberation of Europe. There is nothing else. There is not a Southern Europe. There is no invasion in Sicily, for example. But in particular, of course, the whole Eastern Front is moved from the map. There is only a Western Front. There is only a Normandy. So the Allied forces are here, only the US and Canada and England in particular, who invade and end up there somewhere, well, let's say, in the direction of Berlin, of which we of course all know that they never been there. You also notice that all the lines from Russia are cut if there is some sort of resistance, it starts somewhere in Poland. There's no Red Army on the screen. But also notice there are no camps. The whole Holocaust, even Auschwitz, is not on the map. And then the map is quite extraordinary. If you go from all these Western sites, you will see they relate to veteran heritage of the Second World War. It has a lot to do with the funding, about commercialization. So let's say NIOD is involved in the Netherlands, the War Institute, but also the money comes from V Fund, which is actually the veteran fund, the military fund, and they are the largest spender on remembrances of the Second World War. And you see actually what they remember is not the Holocaust or anything of civic victims, not even the bombing war. It is only this battlefield kind of heritage. And that is, I would call it a falsification of history, but it also shows us, and I think it's a good addition to geography of memory, to speak with John, it shows us actually that on a map is extremely important in what it shows, but also what it doesn't. And so you see here a kind of wiping out of a whole narrative of the Second World War, a whole part of Europe, but in particular, of course, in that same period of Russia. So when Putin wasn't invited in Auschwitz, you could say, for many Western Europeans looking to this map, that was quite obvious. Auschwitz didn't exist, and nor Putin. There was no Red Army. So I hope to make clear, of course, this is quite nonsense, but on the other hand, this map plays its own role. It's made for education, for tourism, etc. So I think we should be very careful for us. If we are invited, I was invited to give advice on this, but that was too late already, and I had a big conflict, actually, the former president of prime minister of my own country, who was in the board of deciding. But you can imagine how strange it is to look at this kind of thing. So, to recapitulate, as I've argued, the assumption of the Holocaust as a common European experience, and hence as a basic part of Europe's post-war identity, raises critical objections. Firstly, the Holocaust paradigm is currently challenged by a deep incompatibility of opinions about the persecution of the Jews and other victims of Nazi terror. Secondly, it's competing with a post-communist occupation paradigm, declaring Soviet terror as equal to Nazi crimes and genocides in a kind of zero-sum competition. And thirdly, Western human rights have increasingly been hijacked by ethnic nationalists opposing Russian and European cultural colonialism with a sort of political victimhood agenda. Now, competing with the still dominant Holocaust memory complex, these new paradigms are being communicated all over the world by literature, movies, and above all, of course, the internet. While like the Holocaust paradigm, they also materialize in historic touristic spaces, memorial sites, and traumascapes, feeding a daily stream of narratives and imaginations of strongly conflicted past. All kinds of atrocities have become commodified into repetitive memory events and turned into markers of identity and othering. Yet this dynamic packaging and politicizing of the ghost of the past not only raises the classic question of the epistemological distinction between history, heritage, and memory, but also that of the moral high ground taken by transitional justice and memory activism. For how to evaluate those many perpetrators of one war having turned into the victims or heroes of another. How to consider politics of European integration facing a virtual remapping of historical boundaries, if not the whole notion of liberation. As it seems to me, we need to critically assess Europe's cultural biography, not only in terms of the relationship of heritage and society, but also with regard to our own biased frameworks facing the rise of cultural essentialism, identity politics, and border fetishism, a kind of new iron curtains, as we notice at the moment, in the current geopolitical and refugee crisis. If only, I would say, to prevent that history repeats itself. Although, I hope with old Marx in that case, it will repeat only as a farce. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we certainly do have some time for questions. If anybody would like to pose a question or address an issue, just raise your hand and we'll approach you with a microphone.
so much. My name is Nina Unkovic. I'm a current Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow, and I'm working on the conservation of in former Yugoslavia region between two world wars. So this is a very interesting connotation you had today. I really much loved your presentation. First, I admire your work. And please, can I have first just one comment and then a proper question? Personally, I'm a war child, so this is topic very much I can connect with it. Just one comment, just Yugoslavian war. When you say Yugoslavian war, just for the public, there was a homeland war in Croatia from 1991-1995 and in Bosnia. So just for you to have this. And we had concentration camp in Croatia. Very much I unfortunately know about that, and we that was 26 years ago. So when you say it can go darker, yes it can, and it was in the middle of Europe, unfortunately. The question is about raising, do you, because I know your work, I'm very familiar, do you see that only in Croatia, but also in the former socialist countries, there is a raising of the national ideology on the impact of the cultural heritage protection? Because now the denying of this socialist communism and anti-fascist monument is very rising up in Croatia. And also a question, because the convention you also mentioned, I was asked once when the war was going on and Dubrovnik was bombarded and split, and so all the UNESCO protected heritage areas were bombarded. What UNESCO did, what as a conservators, what as cultural heritage personas we can do. And I just said nothing, because I saw with my own eyes that we couldn't do nothing, although we had so much conventions and organizations on our side. Thank you.
Yeah, well, to answer your last question, it is true that well, as academics, we can't do much in this case situation. We can critically assess the situation and afterwards, of course, give opinions. But what you actually see in practice is that, let's say, the heritage industry plays a huge role at the moment in rebuilding all parts of former Yugoslavia. But there's also something to question on that, because it's, of course, in all these parts where people have left, things are now be restored, but often restored in the way people want to have it restored, which means that also with foreign aid, of course, in many cases, that the mosques are disappearing from Serbian landscapes, and Catholic churches appear in Croatia more than ever before, and let's say the Orthodoxy reappears in other parts, and in Bosnia there's the influence of Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries in these restoring programs, and Turkey, of course, in particular also. That is what you noticed on one hand. On the other, of course, there is let's say the Bridge of Mostar, this UNESCO kind of heritage is being done as good as possible. But of course, restoring the past after things like this, in which heritage itself, that's the problematic part of what happened in not only in former Yugoslavia, but it's one of the first cases where it happened that clear. But we also now notice it in Syria. It's actually that heritage itself become targeted, because it is world heritage, because people are relating their identity to these sites. These sites become themselves something to bomb and to get rid of. So in that sense, it's not possible to going to defend these heritage sites with big armies, let's say, or building forts around. But you notice this, it is the paradox of making heritage creates a kind of, let's say, almost a sort of genocide of heritage cities and monuments itself. That's what we have to face. And of course the rebuilding project also means that they are appropriated, often not by the same people who own the original site. So they get a new meaning or will disappear completely from the landscape, like happened in Turkey already with the Armenian churches, for example. So I think this is one of the most, you see it, I mean, it's one of the most challenging aspects of heritage studies and heritage practices at the moment.
Thank you. Do you happen to have more questions?
Fascinating presentation. In both the heritage destruction that she was mentioning and in this shifting memory that we have seen, there was a huge role of the media. What do you think? Can you sort of elaborate a little bit and tell us what you think about that?
About what particular? You mean the Bosnia War, the Yugoslav?
No, the shift. I mean, the role that media representation had in presenting the shifting memories in the Ukrainian case and etc.
Well, I noticed, of course, already this. If I mentioned already these movies, but media attention is extremely important. You could say there's a sort of mediatization of memory going on already since the past 25, 30 years, and of course also not only, let's say, public media, also in particular also social media play an incredible important role. And I'm still searching actually for a new kind of research methods to let's say to search the internet, because actually in the internet a lot of things, debates are going on, not in the normal sense of public debate, but you see a lot of things happening there already before they enter the national press or something like that. I was involved myself also in an English Channel 5 production and Smithsonian, American Smithsonian production on archaeology we did in Treblinka with Caroline Sturdy-Coles. And we noticed then how incredible important such media are. Normally you do your work and only years after people read something about it and that's it. In this case we were actually working and founding the gas chambers. The hidden gas chambers. And this script of hidden genocide was so strong by the filmmakers that they immediately it was broadcasted already a few months later. Our very early discussions were really finding the gas chambers. The first interpretations, almost the first minutes, were then broadcast months later when we knew much more about the situation and the backgrounds and so on. It was not in the movie, because in the movie it was important that what Hitler had tried to hide, we found. That was the mission. And then I realized that you're suddenly, as an academic, part of a script, which you can't. I mean, normally we write and we take time and we reflect and we go back from our own opinion and you have debate and change your opinion. It's not possible anymore when you're scripted. And that's, I don't know how it's with you, but it's every day I'm phoned by journalists and they always want to have a quote. Even last week I had, or 2 weeks ago, journalists asking me to something for Krakow, and they went here without me and without others and simply traveled here, and 2 days later it was on the Dutch television. So these are very strange situations that you notice how fast media are, how incredible this outreach is, and how because of the logic of media, the media logic, it works with binary constructions. So if you make it nuanced, then you're not interesting for media. So you have to take a side. And I think this is one of the most difficult parts, because it's our role is actually to go beyond that. And I find it sometimes so difficult that I don't even call back when I notice that and of course that's, in the end you want to reach as many people. So there is a big, let's say I don't have a real answer on that, but I notice it everywhere that media play this immense important role in many ways, and it's difficult for our position to use them, so to speak, in a better way.
I think it's time. I mean, it's 1 p.m. sharp, so I will take this opportunity to offer my thanks to Professor van der Laarse on behalf of all of us.